Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet. This is part 2 of Kimberly Weir's interview with Akshat Rathi. If you haven't already listened to the first part over at The Politics Guys, you might want to do that. If you have, well, here's part 2.
So moving on to solar. I like this part a lot too, because I feel again like I learned a lot about the batteries and I learned a lot about carbon capture and storage and now solar. So how did your experience in getting your parents' house set up with solar panels really show both the promise of solar energy and what it has to offer to developing countries and emerging economies like India and the challenges that they face?
So about 5 years ago in 2019, I worked with my parents to get rooftop solar at home. And it was so easy. I mean, we made a few phone calls and there were already quotes from suppliers saying, here's the price, here's how much it'll cost to install them, here's the steps you need to take to connect it to a utility. Within 2 weeks, they were on the roof, nice and shiny things, ready to be used. And then they sat there for 3 months because the utility is a state-owned utility and has a long waiting time and procedure, and all the T's need to be dashed and I's need to be dotted. And eventually they got those permissions and all the cabling that was needed to get the solar panels running. Already it's been so in less than 5.5 years, because their energy bills went down, the investment they made in the solar panels has already been paid for, which is kind of crazy. But it sort of speaks to this point where even though India did not invent solar panels and nor manufactures much of them, even today, it is still able to benefit from the innovations that happen all around the world. The sort of climate capitalism that played out first through innovation in the US, where the silicon photovoltaic was created in Bell Labs, then government policy and private industry that really built the modern solar industry in Europe, in Germany, and in Spain. And then the industry that really made it very cheap, which is China, which invested a lot in developing very cheap and advanced solar technology. All those players, both countries and private companies, enabled what is now for India the cheapest, most promising source of energy that it can tap into, both on rooftops at home, but also in these massive solar farms. India is now home to 2 of the 3 of the world's largest solar farms. And that sort of speaks to the point of climate capitalism, where if you bring in people, policy, and technology together in different political and economic contexts, you can really unlock a solution.
I think that it's really hopeful that every country in the world signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. This agreement, though, seems to have also stalled out for a variety of reasons, obviously COVID being one and the recession being another. But it's also a signal and assurance that intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations and the UNEP are really pushing and moving in the right direction to address climate change for real this time. And we actually see instances of this happening where the climate change predictors are starting to come true and companies and governments are taking this seriously.
Yeah, I mean, the international space has been one that is complicated and has been slow, but makes a big difference. So we've known about climate science for about 50 years. We've been quite certain about how bad it can get for 30 years. And that certainty brought with it the creation of these international organizations. So under the United Nations Climate Body was created in 1992. That helped create what are the annual summits that happen now, called the COP meetings, the Conference of Parties. And they've been going on for the last 30 years. And, in looking back at those 30 years, you would be a fair judge to say, what have they done? It took the first 20 years of negotiations to get to the point of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And even then, the Paris Agreement itself was sort of a voluntary, everybody has to try and do their bit to be able to meet this goal, but we won't tell you what you have to do. You can decide on your own type of situation. That said, having an international commitment from all countries that have agreed to 1 or 2 targets, in this case 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, does provide the strongest signal to businesses that governments are finally taking it seriously. So until about 2015, you had some businesses that were going ahead thinking this is something governments will eventually act on, they will bring in regulations, our business models will have to change, or companies that were seeing climate impacts affect their bottom line thinking, well, we have to act on this problem, otherwise we won't be able to make enough profits. But those were small, exceptional examples. Since Paris, there's just been a systematic approach to try and tackle this problem because there's been government support and clear target setting that has been enabled because of the Paris Agreement. So in one way, the international diplomacy framework is complicated, broken, does not work as you would want it to. In another way, it is working, and the way we see it working is through business decisions that are now affecting not just a few companies, but tens of thousands of companies.
And not just companies, but other IGOs like the International Energy Agency, which for some people might not be familiar with. This was set up as a way for rich countries to secure fossil fuel access, especially in response to the OPEC crises in the 70s. And yet now this is even an organization that has completely changed to try to set up a more sustainable future, and especially to also help global South countries.
That's right. The International Energy Agency was created in 1974 as a reaction to the oil crises, and it was created by rich countries to create a bulwark against OPEC, against the cartel which had the supply of oil. And for the longest time, that was its main job, to ensure energy security, which meant access to cheap and reliable oil whenever rich countries wanted it. However, because of the Paris Agreement, most of the countries that are part of the International Energy Agency, which are these rich countries, also signed on to these climate goals. And so for them now, it wasn't just about energy security, but also including acting on climate change as a part of the mandate. And I chart the story of Fatih Birol, this Turkish economist who is made the head of the International Energy Agency just before the Paris Agreement, and how he recognizes that this is a new era, and in a new era, international organizations have to address the new challenges that the members are setting. And so he expands the mandate, or at least makes the case to the members to expand the mandate from energy security to also include climate, to the extent where now the very energy models that energy agency produces and are used by investors for big trillion-dollar decisions are also now including climate and climate goals, which are reshaping how investments in the energy industry happen. So it's just one example of an it's just one example of an international institution being changed for this new era. We'll have to do that for a lot of other institutions.
And not only just institutions, but it was really fascinating to read about how Bill Gates started Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the BEV, and how it differs from other venture capital funds, because change does need to happen. And especially people who have deep pockets, this is something that's really important because, as you mentioned in your book, they have an ability to employ a strategy that a lot of companies wouldn't be able to use otherwise, be able to pursue otherwise. So what would you say is the most important takeaway from why private capital is necessary to tackle those big polluting industries that have such tight profit margins?
So we've gone through sort of examples looking at carbon capture, solar, batteries. These are all technologies that were created over decades or sometimes centuries, and had this long winding route to find their way to become a climate solution. They weren't created to be a climate solution, but ended up being the source of clean energy that could be used at scale as a climate solution. they don't take us all the way to solving the problem. As much as renewables will be a huge part of solving for emissions, we will need other technologies to tackle this problem. So things like how can you make sustainable aviation fuel? Because putting batteries in a transatlantic flight may never be possible because of the physics of batteries. And so, how can you produce an oil alternative that is clean, which is to say, it comes from sources that do not produce any greenhouse gas emissions? The same thing will have to be done for fertilizers. Today, fertilizers, mostly ammonia, comes from using natural gas and combining it with nitrogen from the atmosphere. You're going to have to find a clean way to do it. And it's possible to do, but you require technology development. And that's where the innovation pipeline for technology needs to be understood. Almost always the first step is government scientists or government funded research in academic labs doing it just to pursue curiosity and pursue basic science. But often one of those ideas has the potential to be a commercial technology. That only becomes commercial through private capital. We have mastered this form of venture capital, which is, short for adventurous capital, I guess, where you take lots and lots of money and throw it at lots and lots of ideas, knowing that only a few of them will succeed, but will succeed wildly. So you'd pay for all those losses on the failed ideas with that one success you're able to score. And that worked out quite well for software companies. You have these big behemoths of Google and Facebook that came out of this venture capital model. Applying the same model to climate technologies, however, isn't so simple, because the turnaround time for putting the money in and getting your money out is much longer, because you're dealing with hard science problems that need to be solved. And that's where what Bill Gates has done with Breakthrough Energy Ventures is such an interesting idea. They said, instead of looking for a 5-year return cycle, we are going to wait 10, 20 years. They call themselves patient capitalists. And, that was possible because Bill Gates is a rich guy and he has a lot of rich friends. And so they banded together as billionaires trying to support this idea of bringing in more patients for developing climate technologies. But it was not a system that could have just been the billionaires. What Breakthrough was able to show is through this process, they are able to create successful climate technologies. And since then, following the Breakthrough model, there are so many more billion-dollar venture capital funds that are dedicated to climate that are also taking a similar approach to being patient, because this type of innovation is just different.
Yeah, and in order to not just reach zero emissions, but actually have negative emissions, we need to have some real changes. And we also struggle with the fact that as consumers, we want cheaper stuff and we don't want to see prices go up. And so when you're the CEO of a company, yeah, it's one thing to be a billionaire and say, well, I could take this loss, whatever. But if you're the CEO of Unilever, this is a very different sort of situation that you're in. It's hard to believe that Unilever tops the list as the world's most sustainable company. Why? How can other corporations learn from this?
Yeah, the Unilever story goes before we set climate goals. And the clearest way in which I could understand it was to look at ice cream. Unilever is a big seller of ice cream. You've likely had Ben & Jerry's or Magnum or one of the many brands that it owns. And in the past, when there were heat waves, ice cream sales went gangbusters because people wanted something to cool down with. Nowadays, it's not happening because heat waves are becoming so extreme that people are choosing to stay at home rather than go out and buy ice cream. So that's one way in which its profit margin is being affected. But even before having these levels of extreme heat waves affect sales, they were starting to see their supply chain become more expensive, because most of their supply chain is smallholder farmers producing milk or flavors or vanilla or soy. And climate damages on droughts and floods are leading to lower productivity for these farmers, which means they have to either increase their prices or just not sell the good because they don't have anything to sell that year. And that is causing a headache for Unilever, which has this supply chain globally and has to deal with these impacts globally. And so it has a double impact on its bottom line. And that is something that Unilever understood quite early in the game and was among the innovators to figure out how can a company continue to make profit while doing good for the planet. So one of the first things it did was to work on sustainable palm oil. So palm oil is this wonder oil in a way because it's so rich and dense in resources. No other form of oil comes anywhere close to the level of productivity that comes from that comes from palm oil. However, that palm oil production was happening in places like Indonesia, where a lot of rainforest was being cut to make palm oil. And so they started working initially on figuring out how to create sustainable palm oil where forests can be protected and yet palm oil can be sourced sustainably, responsibly. And that was its entry into creating what is now perhaps one of the most comprehensive climate plans that exist for a large corporation. It has had to deal with short-term pressures, as you alluded to. Companies aren't billionaires. They have shareholders that they have to produce reports for and returns for. And so Unilever has had to deal with a lot of shareholder pushback, but it has made the case that because if it acts on climate in the long term, those profits will be much more sustainable than trying to chase down what might be a profitable quarter or profitable year.
And it's not just Unilever who is in this situation. Every corporation that is dependent on either agriculture industry or natural resources or whatever it is that we're talking about, all of these are industries that are potentially threatened by supply chain disruption due to climate change. And that's why I think one of the most important points in your book is about climate justice. It's a theme throughout your book. And a lot of people, when they think about sustainability or they think about climate change, they don't think about the human being equation part. They think about, oh, well, we need to, save the dolphins, save the whales, save the trees and the rainforest. But it's oftentimes they don't think about the people who are actually affected by what happens when we try to save these things. What happens if these people are displaced because that's where they were making money from poaching, and that was really the only way they could make any money. So could you explain what do you mean by climate justice and how developing renewable energy resources can actually help to address this injustice?
So injustice is sort of baked into the climate equation because the countries that produced most of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and are responsible for most of the warming are rich countries. The US is the single largest historical emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. China is now second, and it may never catch up to the amount that the US has ever released in its history. The UK, for example, has put out more greenhouse gas emissions than India, which is, a country that is so much bigger than the UK. And this historical injustice has also meant that the people who are going to suffer from climate impacts tend to be within the tropics, tend to be within developing countries. And so they have this double impact of not contributing as much to the problem as rich countries did, but suffering from the impacts disproportionately more than rich countries would. And then there's the final inequality, which is if you have money, you can actually deal with climate impacts better. You can buy an air conditioner, you can build a seawall, you can move to a different home that is not being eaten up by the sea. As a poor person, you can't do any of that. So injustice is sort of baked into the climate equation from the get-go. That's why climate justice is such an important part of any type of climate solution that will come, where rich countries will have to find ways to pay developing countries for building many of the climate solutions. That's starting to happen through this international diplomacy framework we've talked about. It is never enough. It is never going to be enough. And yet having that annual meeting where developing countries push developed countries to pay money is a good thing. The second way in which this can play out is where developing countries can be given technologies that enable them to take a leap, go beyond polluting sources to a form of energy that would be good for their economy. And renewable energy is really good at that. You don't have to have fossil fuel reserves in your backyard to be able to access energy, because the sun and the wind are free and are often very widely available within the tropical zone. And so if you can find ways in which you can help them find that technology, but also provide them with financing. It doesn't have to be aid, it just needs to be enough money upfront that is available at low interest rates, that they can go out and build a solar farm and build many solar farms, that you would allow them to overcome some of the injustice from the past. However, the other way you could do it, and this is, we are talking between countries, there's also climate justice within countries. So in the US, you have inequality between, white people and black people. That again goes back to the history of the creation of the US. And the Biden administration, in its big climate act, the Inflation Reduction Act, put in very clear, specific tax credits towards environmental justice, where they said, if you build a battery factory in a place where there has been historical injustice, we will give you more tax credits than if you would build it in another place. And that is another way in which you can start to bend the solution set towards the people who are going to be affected the most.
And it is poor people throughout the world who have traditionally, consistently been the ones who are most likely to suffer these injustices. And one thing in my experience with talking to people around the world is they don't want handouts. They don't want aid. They want opportunities to work and have investment and so forth so that they can build up their economies and have the same opportunities. But also, I think what's important is that even from a sheer economic standpoint, it makes economic sense to invest, because more people who are better off have more spending power, and that's one thing that people tend not to consider, that as shareholders, you're actually better off if you have a bigger market for your stuff that you're selling, that you're investing in. And this is why I think that, as you give with the Unilever example, especially, but not just that, but with all of the other examples in your book, Occidental Petroleum or Ørsted, the Danish government, what they end up doing, that all of these different governments and billionaires and organizations and corporations are all starting to move in the right direction. Can we actually continue to change course to tackle climate change? Do you think this is really the way we're going?
Oh, there are a ton more examples. I picked the ones that I did because I wanted a good combination of technology, but also systemic levers. And I wanted to show that this is happening not just in rich countries, but also in developing countries. So the goal was to try and showcase a wide range of examples in a wide range of settings as a way to build a framework for how we can get to zero emissions. So we know technically it's feasible. We can get to net zero by 2050. We know that we have most of the technologies, not all of them, but we do have a way to get to the whole set through innovation. We also know what kind of policies, depending on the political context, can work to enable these solutions to be deployed. So we have the formula. But you're absolutely right that this has to happen in every country, in every domain, in every economic sector. And that's a much, much bigger challenge to meet. And that's why, if there's a pessimism that comes, it is in the scope of the challenge, not in how we solve it. The optimism comes in the fact that there are people solving it already. And so we have to just live in this two-track world now, where on the one hand, because we keep putting out more greenhouse gas emissions, climate impacts will get worse. And the suffering around the world, whether you're rich or poor, will increase. But because the urgency has been going up, and we have this combination of people, policy, and technology unlocking those solutions at an accelerated pace, we are finally starting to solve the problem. Which of these two paths wins out is on us.
And you talk about the people who are involved and pushing for a better world. And sometimes it's from within the government, like with the EVs or with the solar solar power and batteries and so forth. Or sometimes it's the corporations, it's the CEO who steps up and says, hey, I'm going to go long goal, look for the long-term benefits over the short-term benefits and ditch quarterly reports and so forth. And sometimes it's the shareholders, like what you give in the example with Exxon. And it's the shareholders stepping up and saying, hey, we want some real change because we're moving in the wrong direction. If we keep this up, it's going to get worse. Or sometimes it's like the woman who is in her absolute last-ditch effort just decides to glue herself to the Shell building. So it's about the economic payoff and reward is what it always seems to come down to. And we are starting to see, especially as highlighted in your book, that there can be an economic payoff and reward, and at the same time actually move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it is possible to build a better world, not just a world that is addressing the climate challenge, but actually in the process have these solutions that are just better. Electric cars are better. Yes, they have range issues, but they are cleaner, they're easier, they have faster acceleration, they have better digital technology, they have automated driving. They're just better solutions. The same thing is true of heat pumps, for example. You don't have to have burning gas or fuel oil in your house, have somebody come and refill it. You have the electric network, which is getting cleaner by the day. And heat pumps are kind of magical in that they take 1 unit of electricity and give you 4 units of heating or cooling. And so you're getting just a lot more bang for your buck. It's a better solution. Same thing is happening for non-climate related benefits. So electric cars will give you cleaner air, moving away from extra use of fertilizer, but to regenerative agriculture produces cleaner water and thus produces more biodiversity. So you start to repair the planet, provide better solutions to people while trying to solve the climate problem. And that overlapping win-wins are what give me the most hope.
And I think in a way to sort of bring it all together, and this is why I loved the book so much, is because we are super interconnected. All of these moving parts have to kind of work together if we're going to actually achieve some real change. Well, with that, we'll close. Thank you so much, Akshat. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. What a great book. I really hope others will pick it up.
Thank you. I enjoyed the discussion very much.
If you're hearing this, you're a special person. Now, you might already know or think that you're a special person, but what I mean is you're special because almost everyone who listens to podcasts tunes out at the very end. So because you're special, I feel like I can ask you for a special favor, and that is to rate and review Sustainable Planet on whatever podcast app you happen to be listening on. It really helps us out, and Kimberly and I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.